Hello, welcome everyone. I have a few brief announcements to make before we start the talk. We'd like to encourage everyone to stop by the sponsors area, which can be found in the Expo channel of this platform. If you visit a sponsor page, they will have resources and people available to chat about job opportunities. And also there's an open invite to the happy hour with the BSidesNoVA ticket at Punch Bowl in Arlington tonight between 6 and 9 p.m. The address is 4238 Wilson Boulevard, Suite 1180. And I'm excited to announce that the next talk, Integrating the Psychological Concepts of Perception and Cognition into Cyber Practices by Nikki Robinson. You can use the chat window to the right of the screen to ask any questions throughout the talk, and we'll take the last 3 to 5 minutes for a question and answer session where I'll read a few of the questions. So now I'd like to hand it over to Nikki. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you everybody for coming. I wanted to start and just say a huge thank you to BSidesNoVA for having me back again. And as mentioned, I'm going to be talking about perception and cognition, specifically as they relate to cybersecurity. So hello, I'm Nikki. I am currently a security architect with IBM. I'm also an adjunct professor at Capital Technology University. So I teach everything from incident response to quantitative methods, all that good stuff. I hold a doctorate of science in cybersecurity. I'm also working on a PhD in human factors, which is kind of how I got into the subject anyway. That should be done December this year. And I have some industry certs and stuff, but the important note here is just that I started doing this human factors research, which I'm going to get into a little bit, but I started getting into this human factors research, and as a security practitioner, I started seeing some of the connections, started connecting some of those dots between psychology and human factors, which is traditionally based in UX and design. And so I started putting some of those dots together, and that's what really sort of got my interest in doing this research and doing this presentation. So quick disclaimer, all thoughts, feelings, views expressed in this presentation are my own. They do not reflect anybody else. And with that, I am also not a licensed therapist or psychologist. I'm not classically trained in psychology. I have a background in IT and security. I actually almost went into psychology, but ended up going into IT instead. And so I've always had this real interest in psychology. And now that I'm kind of a security practitioner, trying to blend those two together. So what we're going to kind of cover here. So I'm specifically going to be covering cognition and perception as they relate to blue teamers. So specifically kind of our network defenders. And so I kind of want to talk a little bit about that before I get into cognition and perception. And then we're also going to discuss cognitive limitations. And then I'm not going to leave you empty-handed. We're going to talk about, well, what can I do about it? What can I maybe take away back to my organization, or what can I do with this information? All right, so if you've been in security for a while, you're probably well aware of the differences between blue teams and purple teams and red teams. But I wanted to kind of lay the groundwork here for how I'm going to relate cognition and perception to what we do as, on the network defense side. So blue teamers, we're talking about our network defenders. So we're talking about anybody who, you might do incident response, you might be a SOC analyst, you might do threat hunting. You probably are doing some sort of continuous monitoring, whether that's log analysis and correlation, or you're looking at vulnerability scans. You might be, looking at vulnerability reports and turning some of this information over to maybe IT operations. Maybe you're working with management, both on the IT side and the security side. Maybe you're working with engineers and developers. So that sort of leads me to this. As network defenders, we have so much information that we're constantly taking in, right? So everything from new vulnerabilities to new types of threats, new exploitations, how people are actually exploiting the software, different IT projects. So as new technology is coming in, maybe you're helping with some of the security assessments or analysis. Maybe from the security tooling side, maybe you're managing those security tools. There's a lot that blue teamers can do and possibly do, especially if you have a smaller team. You might be filling a number of these different roles within your security team. So that's why I kind of wanted to to talk a little bit about everything that blue teamers do. So you're doing all of these things while you're probably managing alerts. So you might be managing SOC alerts. You might be looking at, if someone's scanning your network, you might be reviewing all this information. So you're constantly taking in all this information, all while working with lots of different teams. As I mentioned, you might be working with IT operations, engineers, developers, management, executive management. You may have your own chain of management that's working with IT management. So there's all this layered complexity where you need to have this technical comprehension, this technical understanding of tools and software, but you also have to have, what's sort of called soft skills, but emotional intelligence. You have to be able to communicate effectively. You probably need to understand how to write reports. So there's a lot that goes into being a blue teamer, besides just understanding the, kind of technical components of the job. So when I started to break all of this down and I started looking at all of this complexity and all of these, things are constantly changing, we're constantly learning, I started to think about, well, how do these psychological components kind of affect us, as network defenders? So I'm going to start out by talking about cognition. And again, I'm not a trained psychologist, but I love research. And so I've done a lot of research on these topics. And this is sort of what I've taken away from what I've been seeing as far as research goes. Cognition, specifically, we're talking about conscious reasoning. So I love the chess example because I'm a chess player. I've been playing chess since I was, I think, 6 or 7. And it's a really great way to help describe what cognition means. So how do I determine what the best move is? So if I'm moving my pawn, if I move my pawn forward, am I moving it into a danger zone? Am I moving it into a place where it could potentially be taken? If I move it into that place where it could potentially be taken, would that actually give me an advantage? Maybe it would give me an opening to take their queen, for example. So this is all of that decision-making process that we do. And for chess specifically, you're not just thinking, I've got to think several moves ahead. Maybe you need to think 10 or 15 moves ahead, but you also have to consider how your opponent is going to move. So if I move here, what will my opponent do? If I move to this spot, will they be able to take my piece? So it's all of this really complex decision-making that you have to kind of do. So that's sort of a nice way of understanding what cognition really means. So cognition, we're also talking about sensory input, and we're going to get a little bit into that as we get into perception as well. But we're talking about managing physical actions as well as empathy. So it's a really layered, complex kind of concept in psychology, which is why I wanted to kind of break it down. So underneath that decision-making, we have fast thinking and slow thinking. So fast thinking, you can kind of think of as intuition, and especially from the cybersecurity side, when I think about, intuition as someone who's a network defender, as a SOC analyst, I need to use my intuition to understand the alerts that I'm seeing. So for example, if I'm seeing a bunch of alerts come in at one time, maybe from the same IP, I'm seeing a bunch of alerts and they're just scanning a bunch of our servers. They're just trying to see what's out there. I can kind of look at that, and especially if I've been in the environment for a while, and I can kind of see, this is kind of expected behavior, all right, I might ignore that for now unless I see something that kind of sticks out to me. But if I start to look through these alerts and I start to see something that's an anomaly, something that looks, kind of strange to me, that would also be intuition based, where I'm saying, wait a second, this one looks a little funny to me. Are they trying to drop something? Is this a precursor to potentially dropping malware or, trying to gain control of my system? So that's kind of your fast thinking, your intuition, how you would use that kind of as a network defender. Slow thinking is something I think we probably do more if we're responding to an incident, we need to use some of that intuition, but we also need to use this methodical approach. We need to consider how someone got into our system and then maybe how far they got into the system. So how many systems did they compromise? Did they compromise user accounts? How far did they get into the network? Did they elevate privileges? Did they drop malware or ransomware? So that's where you start to get into that kind of that slow thinking, that real decision making, where you're like using your kind of your expertise, your knowledge, everything that you know to kind of help you with this methodical process. So that's more of that slow thinking, where you're kind of taking in all of your experiences to help you make those decisions. So we're talking about kind of blending learning and memory. So we're learning new things as we're using our memory, and maybe things that have happened to us before, situations we've been in that may affect how we think about a situation. So those all kind of play into that. To take that down a step further, we get into metacognition. So metacognition is really interesting to me. You know, you hear people saying like, oh, that's meta, or, you know, we talk about metadata, things like that. I mean, it's sort of like that. It's thinking about thinking. So using metadata is kind of what we can do to help bring critical awareness, bring that critical component to thinking about ourselves. So how do we think about our own thinking, which is like really layered, but that's kind of where we get into becoming a better decision maker. So if we took that incident that we responded to, and we want to kind of break that down and go into that thinking, well, how did I handle this? Could I have handled it better, et cetera, et cetera? That's where you get into metacognition. So to break this down, we talked about a couple other things, but to break this down into specifically cybersecurity, human factors, as I mentioned, was kind of that UX design. So how are we creating tools for our users? So specifically here, how are we creating these security tools? Are we creating them in a way that makes sense for our network defenders? Are the malware analysis tools, the vulnerability scanning and reporting tools, are we using them really effectively? Are we using them in a way that makes sense to our network defenders? So if I'm using a tool, let's say I'm getting a vulnerability report, and it's something that I need to send to IT operations for action. Well, I can't send them a 300-page report, because as a security analyst, I might understand, well, yes, you might want to sort this way or look at it this way or create a pivot table or however you might look at that report. But from the IT operations side, they might not have that depth of understanding from the security side. And so it's, how can I, as a security analyst or a network defender, how can I kind of think about how IT operations might use this report to maybe make a better report? So it's kind of that taking that step back and thinking about how the user or someone who's going to consume this document, how they might use it, and then how could I better create this? Maybe making it smaller, maybe creating a pivot table for them so that they don't have to do it, something like that. And then taking it from the security analyst perspective, when I'm using these security tools, am I able to use them effectively? Do I have time to configure them properly? It's one of those things that I know I've seen in my past where you get access to these big beefy tools, and we're only using like 20% of them as far as like how much we could configure and use, because we just don't have time. We're busy. We're looking at alerts, we're writing reports, we're handling projects, we're bringing in new software, we're doing security assessments. Maybe we're doing web application pen testing as well, depending on the size of your security team. So are the security tools that we're using really effective for us? Are they really kind of getting the job done? And then prioritizing risk management. So this is something where I think cognition and that metacognition, I think, really comes into play. So risk management, it's kind of the same way we talk about, maturing your vulnerability management program. You can mature your risk management program or your risk management activities. And so are we prioritizing risk properly? Are we considering the business? Are the right teams involved? When we prioritize risk, are we considering all of our assets? How are we really doing this? And I think that's what's really important when you take that step back and say, am I thinking about this properly? Am I considering all of the problems and all the things I need to consider for a risk management program? And so I think understanding the concept of metacognition can really help improve risk management and how we think about risk management across our environments. Employee turnover. So this is a big one. This one could possibly lead to malicious insiders who, maybe they're getting burnt out because they have to take in all this information and they're still not able to maybe do their job effectively because they're so burnt out and they're so tired and they've been working 12-hour days for years, and they're getting burnt out, and maybe they turn into what becomes a malicious outsider, but a malicious insider. So it's something that something I started considering when I was looking into cognition. It was like, ooh, if we start to really understand how our network defenders are handling all of this information, all this input and all this output, maybe we can start to create a better environment for them. Maybe we can start to understand the challenges a little bit better and maybe prioritize some other things to help make their jobs easier. So perception. So I wanted to bring this up just because, I'm not a psychologist, but there's some debate on whether cognition and perception are the same thing. And I just wanted to bring that up because there is some research out there that's a little bit conflicting. But the research I found, perception, it's really based on our sensory information, how we organize and interpret it. So for example, if I go to the beach and I pick up a rock on the beach and it's smooth, it's a smooth rock, that is my touch sensation. That is my touch sensory telling my brain that, yes, this rock is smooth. Yes, that is what I'm feeling on my hand. So it's all of those sensory things like touch, sight, hearing, taste, smell, all of those things. That is all kind of ties into perception. And that can lead us to memories of similar situations that might influence us, especially in our decision making. So it's sort of that step down into how we actually perceive situations, what our perception means based on the situation. Again, to kind of take a step down under perception, there's bottom-up processing and there's top-down processing. So bottom-up processing, that's what's really happening in the moment. That is, right now, I am seeing something, I'm reacting to it, I'm having feelings right at this moment. So that could be, if I'm a SOC analyst, when I'm regularly looking at alerts, I'm constantly digesting information all the time. And that's that bottom-up processing. I am in the moment looking at things and handling them as I see them. That top-down processing is more about experience and relying on experience. So that top-down perception versus bottom-up processing. So to give kind of an example, bottom-up processing, it's like if you stub your toe. Well, that's your toe is hitting that door and it is sending a signal to your brain that says, oh my gosh, that hurt, my toe hurts. Whereas top-down perception, there was a really nice example where, handwriting, if you're reading someone's handwriting and maybe it's a little bit sloppy or it's kind of difficult to read, if you have a full sentence from someone, it's a lot easier to digest than if you just had one word. It might be harder to perceive what that word is. Whereas if you have a lot more context, that maybe you could make a better decision about what that person is trying to tell you. So that's kind of the difference between bottom-up processing and top-down processing. And that, again, that's that kind of that step down into perception and what that means. So I think this is when I started looking at more into perception in cybersecurity, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done here. And I think it's worth being aware of that, our past experiences influence our decision-making. So for example, take into account that report that we've given to IT operations. We've said, you've got to fix these, 20, 30, 40 vulnerabilities, whatever it might be on this system. Well, maybe the IT person says, I'm not doing this because maybe, I don't have time in my maintenance window, or, I've pushed patches before and they've broken my system and, I'm not doing it. So, instead of taking that as like a frustrating experience, it's almost like, well, how did they perceive that interaction? Have they had really bad experiences in the past with maybe someone who was in security, or maybe being told they had to apply patches and it negatively affected their systems? Maybe it took their whole system down when they applied patches. That happens all the time. Maybe they got written up because that system went down, even necessarily their fault. They were just trying to apply these patches. So it is possible that, our past experiences and our interactions, either with people or, technology, could really influence how we handle a situation. Another great example that I think probably a lot of us can relate to is Java. Like, let's say I'm a developer and I'm told I have to upgrade Java because it's end of life, or, it's going end of life, got to upgrade it. And, me as a developer, I'm like, no, I'm not doing that. That might take down my application. Maybe I'm going to have problems if I do that. maybe it's going to affect my customer. I'm not going to do that. And so you start to get into this, maybe they have this perception because something like this happened in the past, that their application broke or they weren't able to use their tools that they were used to using. So this perception can really play into how people make decisions, both from the security side and from the IT side. And taking it from the security analyst perspective, maybe they had that same really bad experience with IT where they came back and said, no, we're not doing this, we're not doing this, we're not doing this. And so security has to the security person has to kind of change their way they do things. And they're just like, no, you know what? We're enforcing this now. You have to do this. And so that's when you start to get that you start to have maybe some friction, or maybe the teams aren't working as well because of this perception that, maybe security is trying to push something on them and IT is not being helpful, or whatever the case may be. But that perception really plays into, this inefficiency and in how we're potentially getting things done. And then attention, that's another thing that plays into perception, is how long can we pay attention? There's a lot of studies out there on how long we can pay attention. And if we're getting, let's say we're getting interrupted a lot, our attention span anyway might be short. And then if we're getting interrupted constantly for alerts or for an email or for a meeting or for this or that, how effective are we really being? Are we able to really digest this information? So if I'm looking at log analysis, that's just like another example here. It might be really tough for me to really sit down and digest this information that I'm seeing in these logs to potentially see these alerts. Maybe something malicious was coming through, but it kept getting interrupted, by emails or by alerts and everything. And so, it's kind of that, okay, I need to take time to understand kind of what's going on here and how perception might kind of affect what's going on with my log analysis. And then the last point I wanted to make on this slide was just, how do we hire and train cybersecurity professionals? So how do we perceive that person that's coming in for this job? Are we, if they don't have a certification, is our perception changed? Should it be, things like that. So it's just something to kind of be aware of, that, maybe our perception affects us when we're hiring or when we're maybe training people too. Okay, so one more kind of big note before I get into kind of our lessons learned here. So cognitive limitations. This is a really important concept, because just what I mentioned at the beginning, our blue teamers are network defenders, and a lot of people in security in general, we're taking in so much information all the time. And there's attacks every day. There's alerts, there's vulnerabilities, there's threats, there's APTs, there's all this information that we have to digest and put into our security programs. Not to mention federal regulations and laws and guidelines and all these. So cognitive limitations are really the limits on our memory and attention. And specifically here, I'm talking about technology, how it affects us in technology and cybersecurity. But we're limited in the amount that we can visually and perceptually understand and handle. And this is just our, what we've got going on at work, right? Not to mention all the personal stuff and everything else that's going on in your life, but this is just your job and all the things that you have to kind of consider in cybersecurity. So I bring up cognitive limitations because I think it's an important concept to understand, and something that can really play into what we do in cybersecurity, and maybe just taking that empathy and that understanding of, hey, people are processing all this information all the time. I can't know everything. So it's sort of just that kind of that awareness of this concept and how it might actually be playing into your cybersecurity program. All right, so what can I do about it? I've got this information now. I understand what cognition and perception and cognitive limitations are. What can I do? So I'm a big fan and a big proponent of including cybersecurity education as part of each field. So like part of everything, there should be some component of cybersecurity education, right? Whether you're in HR or finance, or you're going in to be an executive, you're getting an MBA, there should be some cybersecurity training in there somewhere, right? And then awareness, just knowing that psychology plays a part into our cybersecurity programs. And I'm just specifically talking about blue teams here. There are plenty of implications across other teams in cybersecurity too. I just wanted to kind of hone in on that here. Consider hiring someone with a background in psychology. There's a lot of great benefits to that too. And then understanding how perceptive and cognitive limitations might might affect your own teams. Maybe it affects, people that you work with. IT teams have this onslaught of new information, new technology all the time too. Maybe it's something that, being aware of, we can try to help increase that collaboration and communication between teams. And then think about how human factors and designs can play into us. That is also super important. And it's just that awareness. I didn't until I started researching, but now I see the benefits of the understanding human factors and design. So just that awareness, and go out and do some research, of course, if you're interested. And so I think we left about 4 minutes for questions. Here's my LinkedIn information. Please reach out to me if you have questions. I'm happy to talk about any of this. I think it's super interesting, and again, I'd be happy to take any questions, and hopefully my moderator can help me out if there are any questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Nikki. That was great. We have 4 questions. Our first one's from Ken Connell. He asks whether you think it's a good idea for companies to use personality assessments like Myers-Briggs and to inform the hiring process.
Okay, yeah, that's a tough one because Myers-Briggs, I think there's another test out there too, similar to the Myers-Briggs. So I don't know, because there are plenty of people that when they take tests like that they may not be as honest, and maybe not trying to not be honest, but they just may not be as honest, maybe because the questions are a little intimidating. Those are really big tests for people to take. So I think it would be a little tough to base hiring someone on those tests. But that's just kind of my first intuition on that one.
Okay, great. And next question is, what are some good ways to practice fast, slow thinking in a cyber context?
Oh, that's a great question. I love that. So yes, scenarios, go through tabletop exercises. That is absolutely the best way to test those things. And you can do tabletop exercises in 2 ways, right? You could do it in that fast thinking mode where you're trying to see if someone's intuition can maybe find if they're seeing a bunch of alerts really quickly. If you can kind of spot the anomalous one, that would be a really great fast thinking one. And then the slow thinking, just doing those tabletop exercises in an incident response scenario, so that people can really understand that methodological approach to handling an incident like that. And that helps them kind of figure out like, oh, we could try this or try that, or I should talk to this person, or so I think that might help there.
Next one is, do you have any ideas on how to make security awareness universally available outside of organizations and local communities?
Yes, I mean there's a lot of free training out there. I'm kind of a big believer in, like, it's kind of like if you don't know, you don't know, which is why I love doing talks like this to try to help bring awareness. So I think it's really just trying to go out there and dive into anything that's open source.
Okay, and finally, we may have time for this one or get booted, but are there any resources you'd recommend for anyone who'd like to learn more about this topic?
Yes, I mean, anything from APA, the American Psychological Association. There's a ton of great universities that have free research too, hopefully. So I would say, yes, just go out there, do some research. Google Scholar is your friend.
All right, and that's it for the questions. So thank you, Nikki. That was excellent. Appreciate it.
Great, thank you.